what a treat to be here. I didn't remember that particular anecdote from the wedding, but I'm sure I was delighted to meet young Ms. Onifer, now studying medicine. And it really is wonderful to be here because it is true that what you do is monumental. And I say that from my perch of many, many years as a trustee of Save the Children and an advocate for children around the world. So I am particularly thrilled to be here with all of you advocates. And what a great morning it's been. I mean, the Howard Singers, the fabulous Eastern High School Choir, Dr. Hassig's really inspiring speech. And how about that little boy in the videotape at the beginning? He was fabulous. He really was. So it is great to be with this group here because you are really the most uplifting people to come to Washington since the Pope. Really. I mean, and the Pope comes, right? He goes into the chamber of the House of Representatives, and it's this great moment. And, you know, they were all given all these instructions that they weren't supposed to clap, and of course that was ridiculous. And so they were kind of nervous about it, though, and not sure what they were supposed to do. So they decided that it was okay for them to clap for the golden rule. Right? So the Pope starts to say, do unto others, and they all start clapping, right? And then the next day, John Boehner announces that he's not going to run again, that he's going to resign as Speaker, and they all stand up and clap for that. So much for, you know, so much for the golden rule. So now that you've had this uplifting morning, I'm going to drag it down because my assignment is to tell you what's going on in Washington. Oh, dear. I mean, you really are at a point where we can't even elect a Speaker of the House. Poor Paul Ryan is being bludgeoned into taking the job. I mean, you all have people who want to run for president-elect of this organization against each other, not in the House of Representatives. I mean, you can't get anybody to run for Speaker. And when Paul Ryan says he'd actually like to spend some time with his children, nobody knows what he's talking about, right? I mean, usually when a politician says he wants to spend time with his family, it's because the sheriff is at the door. And but he actually means it, so it's been a problem. And you know, this is something we really haven't seen before in the House of Representatives. It's been common in the British House of Commons that the Speaker, by tradition, it's not true anymore, but by tradition, was not someone who wanted to take the job because the job was to speak truth to the monarch. And there was a famous day in 1510 when two speakers were beheaded the same day. And so it was really hard to get the third guy to take the job. And as a result, they still, you know, as a ceremonial thing, drag the Speaker of Commons up to the dais to remind him or her that they're supposed to speak truth. But in this country, that has not been the case. We have had some rough speakers elections before this one. There was one before the Civil War that took 2 months and 133 ballots. And then that speaker only served, that was Nathaniel Banks, only served a term. But then the first Speaker of the Republican Party, right before the Civil War, again, it took 2 months and 44 ballots. And that was a gentleman, it was a freshman. That was the best they could do, was to elect a freshman because anybody who had been around didn't want him. And he was a compromise candidate. And pick had failed. And it's a period that I write about in my latest history book, Capital Danes, which is the Civil War history. And so I know, because I write women's history, I know what the women thought about this Speaker of the House, and it wasn't good. I mean, one of the wonderful things about writing women's history is that you get to read their mail. And men's letters are just awful. You know, they know they're going to be published. It's as if they were written by the bronze and marble statues. But the women's letters are letters, and they are filled with politics and news, but also gossip and truth, and they're frank and funny and wonderful. So about that Speaker of the House, Abigail Brooks Adams, who was the daughter-in-law of John Quincy Adams, said that Speaker Pennington was a silly old goose who was weak as water. And he was certainly too weak to keep the South from seceding. Well, the reason I even bring this up, other than the fact that it's funny, is that writing history is actually very useful in terms of having some perspective of what's going on today in Washington. Because people ask me all the time, I mean all the time, is this the most partisan time ever in our history? And the answer to that question is no. They're not shooting each other. And that's, metal detectors, good. But Burr Hamilton is just the most famous of the duels. They used to duel all the time. They would have an argument on the floor of the House of Representatives, and then in the term of art, they would call each other out and go out to Bladensburg, where there was a dueling ground, and they'd then murder each other over political speech. And Burr Hamilton, by the way, think about that. Aaron Burr was the sitting vice president of the United States, and he murdered his political enemy over political speech. Now, our most recent vice president had a problem with a gun, but as far as I know, that was not over speech. We are in a very, very partisan time, even though it isn't the most partisan time ever. And of course, that time, which was the most partisan time ever, led to the Civil War. So we don't want to repeat that. It ended up with more than 600,000 American dead and the country in ruins. So it's not exactly something that we want to repeat. But it is, in fact, one of the most polarized times, other than that we have seen in our history in a very long time. South Carolina, Senator Lindsey Graham, who's now running for president, you wouldn't notice because he's always relegated to the little kid debate, but and he's, a foreign policy expert and a veteran, but never mind, he's not a reality TV star, so, but he says, says if the Democrats have an idea, we can't support it, and if we have an idea, they can't support it, because what's blue is blue and what's red is red, and we can't cross the lines. Well, of course, that's a recipe for getting nothing done. And it wasn't always this way. I had the enormous honor a couple of years ago to have been asked by Betty Ford to be one of the eulogists at her funeral. And I would have been terrified, except for that Mrs. Ford told me exactly what she wanted me to say. And what she wanted me to talk about was how things used to be in Washington. And she had been there for my last interview with President Ford. And he said to me, Cokie, I just don't get what's going on in Washington these days. And that was before it was anywhere near as bad as it is now. And he said, when I was minority leader of the House of Representatives, and your father, my father, Hale Boggs, was the majority leader, he said, we were best friends. He said, when we'd get in the cab together at the Hill and go downtown, this was an exaggeration, they did have drivers, but he said, we'd go downtown to someplace like the Press Club, and we'd say, what are we going to argue about? And he said, it was a legitimate debate. We really did disagree about means to an end, and it was partisan. For heaven's sakes, we were the leaders of our parties in the House of Representatives. But then we'd get back in the cab and be best friends. And that was really true. That is gone, just absolutely absent from this city now. And it is one of the main reasons that nothing can get done, and why Congress is in such a pickle at the moment, with the country ready to default on the debt by November 3rd if they don't do something, with the government running out of money by early December if they don't do something, our highways disintegrating because they can't pass a highway bill, any number of things that are a real problem because they can't get together. And so people, the next question is why? What happened? What changed? Well, a few things happened. One is that generation, the generation that was Jerry Ford and my father, came to Congress immediately after World War II. And they were veterans. They were they were huge classes. Big Republican class of 1946, big Democratic class of 1948. And they had fought in the war. They ran as self-conscious veterans, the men who went, not the men who sent. And they were men. And the whole country had been to war. There was rationing and people sacrificing. And so there was a strong sense of who the enemy was. It wasn't the guy across the aisle, it was the dictator across the sea. And of course that continued for many years because of the Cold War. And so that generation was a different generation. It's also true, though, that the families used to come to town. So we all knew each other. The moms, and it was the moms, were in the PTA together. We went to church together. We went to picnics together. One of my best friends growing up, still a good friend, was Libby Miller, whose father, Bill Miller, was a Republican, conservative Republican from upstate New York, who then was head of the Republican National Committee and then ran with Barry Goldwater as his running mate in 1964. It would be hard for our fathers to demonize each other when we were playing Clue in each other's basements, and so you had those kinds of relationships. The media is part of the problem. We tend to give first of all, there is the screaming media, on both sides, and both in cable television and talk radio and on the blogosphere. But even in the mainstream media, there's a tendency to give our microphones to the loudest voices, rather than the people in the middle who are considered boring and reasonable. And then there is the permanent campaign, where people are constantly having to raise money, and outside groups are providing a lot of that money, and they have these scorecards that they keep about how people vote on various things. They get them to hold votes on things for the purpose of being scored, for the purpose of of raising money for their organization. And that also makes people very nervous about how they're voting and what they're doing. And then there is the drawing of district lines. And I think this is absolutely key. The way lines are drawn for congressional seats now are so exact that a member of Congress really can pick his or her voters instead of the voters picking the members of Congress. And of course, we've always had gerrymandering. It's named after one of the founders, Elbridge Gerry, but the difference now is computers. So you can find, every one-eyed veteran who votes Democratic and put them in one district, and the Democrat's going to win. And what that means is the only way you can get in trouble is if you're not pure enough ideologically inside your own party, because then somebody will challenge you in a primary. So if you're not left enough as a Democrat or right enough as a Republican, that is the difficulty you can get into. I had an experience the last year of George Bush's presidency, where his press secretary, Dana Perino, called me up, and I was surprised. I don't cover the White House, and I didn't expect to hear from her. I didn't know her. I only saw her on TV. And she said, Cokie, the president would like to know if you would like to ride out to Andrews Air Force Base in the limousine with him when he goes to greet the Pope. And I said, okay. I guess I can clear my schedule. Now, the reason that I was invited to do this is because I speak Pope. My father, who I've referenced, was lost in a plane crash in Alaska and never found. And my mother, Lindy Boggs, ran for the seat and served for 9 terms for 18 years. And then she retired and discovered that retirement was hard work because, everybody asked you to do everything. And so at the age of 81, she took a new job in a new country as the United States ambassador to the Vatican. And we in the family were very pleased. This was going to be a wonderful capstone to a career in public service where she could serve both her country and her church. And we'd get to go to Rome all the time, a very good thing. But then what happened in this country happened, and my mother found herself representing Bill Clinton to the Pope. Think of it. It's the toughest job in the diplomatic service. If anybody could do it, Mama could. President Clinton has said to me, the Pope liked me, Cokie, and I'm sure that's true. But at any rate, Mama then came home to New Orleans, our hometown, where her house was on Bourbon Street. And I mean on Bourbon Street, right smack dab in the middle of all the honky-tonk on Bourbon Street. If you've been to Bourbon Street, you've been to Mama's house. And when my children were small and would walk past the strippers and the other neighbors, I'd say, through the woods and over the hills to grandmother's house we go. And then she moved from Bourbon Street to the Vatican, and I teased her that the costumes hadn't changed. It was still guys in dresses, but at any rate, because of my mother, I was invited along on this ride, which was very interesting. And the president wanted to talk to me about how he was breaking precedent to go greet the Pope at Andrews, because normally the head of state comes to the White House and the president meets him there. You've seen that picture a million times, right? The president and first lady on the steps of the portico, the car pulling up underneath. But he was changing that and going out to Andrews because he wanted to underline how important he thought the moral authority of the Pope was. And you notice President Obama just replicated that with greeting Pope Francis. So we talked briefly, because it doesn't take long in a presidential motorcade to get anywhere. But and also you're talking to the back of their heads because he's, they're waving. But anyway, he was talking about the importance of the Pope, and then we moved on to sort of the church in America, and I asked him about immigration, which was an issue that was one that the bishops had worked very closely with him on. And he said to me, he said, Cokie, and I'm quoting here, I tried and tried and tried to get my party to do the right thing on immigration. And I couldn't because of the way district lines are drawn. And people, just too terrified to vote on anything that the base of the party disagrees with on either side because of the fear of being challenged in a primary. So that has a tremendous effect inside the institution. A national journal does regular looks at how people vote in the Congress. And they have this sort of measurement they take of whose voting record is between that of the most liberal Republican and the most conservative Democrat. And in 1982, in the Reagan administration, out of 435 members of the House, 344 of them were in that middle ground. 1999, 266 of them were in that middle ground. Now there is one. and that is Walter Jones of North Carolina, and he is being challenged in a primary right now. In the Senate, 0. There is not one person in that middle ground who can get things done and put together the compromises that are required to make legislation happen. And so it is a really difficult situation we are in, and it's one that is likely to continue for a good while because the society is also quite polarized. Even though the plurality of people identify themselves as moderate, and now the party with the plurality of voters is independent because of this polarization of the two political parties, there's still a lot of divisiveness in the society, both in terms of party and in terms of race and in terms of sex and in terms of ethnicity and in terms of age. So there are a lot of problems out there that are going to be very difficult to fix. I think there might be some long-term solutions, which I'll talk about in a minute. But first, I want to talk about the short term and what to do as long as we're stuck with this situation, because that's what's going to be the case for a little while. And that's where your advocacy becomes so incredibly important. People are voting in these primaries on a punish and reward system, and so can you. You can do that about your issues and the things that you care about. You just saw the wonderful educational campaigns that have gone on around SIDS and about obesity and around vaccines, especially around vaccines. And now I know that there are all kinds of wonderful things happening in terms of people going into the hospitals and suggesting to the new parents that they open up a 529 for a college education, which is a great idea. And I was thrilled to see that you are now recommending that in your patient visits that you ask children if they're hungry, because that is a very, very important question, I'm sad to say. 1 in 5 of our kids, maybe 1 in 4, goes to bed hungry every night. And that is not something that we expect to see in the United States of America. And it is not something that we really, I don't think anybody in this country wants to see a child go to bed hungry. But you have to bring attention to it in order to fix it. And that is where the advocacy comes in. Advocacy really does make an enormous difference. People think that, the only way you can get to a member of Congress and make a difference is by huge campaign contributions. But that's really not true. The most effective lobbying organization in this city is old people. Social Security, AARP, people my age. And they don't give money. They're tight. And but they vote, and they vote their issues, and therefore they are incredibly effective. I always joke that the Pentagon will be rubble around our ankles and Social Security will still exist. So it is, it is a very good example of advocacy. Mothers Against Drunk Driving, they didn't have any money. They had a horrible story and were able to get it out. And within months of forming as an organization, they were able to convince the Congress to withhold federal highway funds from any state that did not raise the drinking age to 21. Now, you may or may not think that's a good idea, but that's what they were able to do because of advocacy. And so I would really recommend that you have the equal passion. Of course, the group that you know well that is incredibly passionate is the NRA. And you can be just as passionate, particularly since you are so incredibly well respected. I mean, as you've heard, who doesn't respect their pediatrician? You know, you're so well respected, you get phone calls all day and all night. You know, I mean, the things people call about do, I must say, amuse me. I'm sure they don't always amuse you, but, you know, the baby has a little rash, really. Were the mosquitoes around yesterday? Anyway, but there are several pieces of legislation that are up there right now that are terribly important. The reauthorization of the Healthy, Hunger-Free Kids Act, which not only deals with WIC and school lunches, but with summer meals, which, you know, sometimes when school's out, the kids don't get eat at all. And that becomes an enormous problem. I was just in Appalachia for Save the Children, and you know, seeing white American rural poverty that is persistent over generations is something that you can only fix by getting to the children, and not only making them healthier, but getting into homes for with newborns to try to engage the parents and, you know, get the babies reading and all of the rest of it. And it is a very important need in this country. You heard Dr. Hassing talking about children's needs in disaster. We discovered after Katrina, which has hit I'm from New Orleans, that there was nothing set up in this country for children after disasters. I travel all over the world with Save the Children. I've been to the poorest places, the most backward places, the, you know, northwest frontier provinces of Pakistan. Don't go. But after disaster, the international community absolutely is in there knowing what to do for children. That wasn't true here in the United States of America until Katrina hit, and we organized through advocacy children's organizations led by Save the Children, but all the others too, to get in after each disaster and make sure that areas that are put aside for safety have child kits, so that there's some diapers and some formula and some cribs and some private places so that children don't see the kinds of unimaginable things they saw in the Superdome after Katrina. And then all the psychosocial development as well after a disaster. So really important. And then there's the international issue, because it's not just our kids who need us. Right now, there are 2 million Syrian children not going to school. 2 million of them as refugees. And the Reach Every Mother, Every Child Act, which I know you were involved in, is also a wonderful way to try to get to the mothers and children of the world. It is one of the rare instances of bipartisanship right now, and it's aimed at saving 15 million kids, 600,000 mothers around the world. And because one of the things we do know is that saving newborn lives is a success story. We can do this. It doesn't require any new information, any new technology. It's cheap. It just requires getting to those moms and getting them breastfeeding, getting a warm hat on the baby's head, giving very cheap vaccinations, and keeping the babies warm at first. I mean, it's so simple and so effective and so satisfyingly effective that it is really something that has made a tremendous difference over the last several years. So I would say, you know, in this time that we're living in right now, where members of Congress feel the heat to be punished or rewarded on very specific issues, that you pick one or two and go after it and make sure that they feel that they're punished and rewarded on your issues as well as everybody else's, because you can make an enormous difference. You really can. For the long term, it's harder, but there's some systemic things we can do. I think that having open primaries helps. It gets more moderate people into the polls. Encouraging people to vote in primaries where the turnout is tiny in many cases and is always the true believers, getting more people participating in the primaries. Having commissions draw district lines. The Supreme Court has upheld that recently, and that really does make a difference. But the biggest difference is the voters. And if at some point the voters start to say, we reward and punish you according to whether you come together and get things done or not, and reward those who get something done and punish those who don't, that's where the difference will come. And that's where you can make such a difference. So thank you very, very much for having me here today. It was a real delight to be with you. Thank you.